And as with many components of systemic racism, the negative impact of laws like these on people's lives are compounded by other racist laws. Getting swept up into the criminal justice system for a nonviolent drug crime can mean that you lose your right to vote and that you have to check a box on a job application indicating that you are a felon. And you can be barred from certain government services like public housing. But as Dave says, that has to do with more socioeconomic reasoning. So let's talk about those socioeconomic reasons, Dave. Because as I mentioned, laws that explicitly favor one race over another is not the definition of systemic racism. Systems are comprised of many components, not just laws. For example, there are policies that govern everything from your workplace to local municipalities all the way up to the federal government that are not laws, but are very much a part of systemic racism in America and greatly impact the socioeconomic status of black people. For example, the system of wealth accumulation has created perhaps the most persistent, insidious, and consequential legacy when it comes to the history of systemic racism in this country, resulting in a staggering disparity between white people and black people. But is it, as Ben Shapiro claims, because of black culture? No, but let's first consider the fact that the majority of the wealth that people accumulate over their lifetimes comes from two places: inheritance and home ownership. Considering black people were enslaved for over 200 years, meaning they were not paid for their labor, and then lived under Jim Crow segregation laws for the next 90 years, I would say that it has been pretty hard for black people to accumulate wealth via inheritance under those conditions. And this is not ancient history. I mean, there are people alive today whose parents were enslaved. So how about home ownership? Well, let's listen to what Richard Rothstein, author of a book, The Color of Law, has to say about the way housing policy has been implemented in this country.
And the reason is another federal program run by the Federal Housing Administration that subsidized the movement of white families out of central cities into single-family homes in the suburbs that were exclusively white. So the federal government guaranteed loans to mass production builders. The most famous example, perhaps, is Levittown. Levitt could never have assembled the capital to build 17,000 homes for which he had no buyers. He got loans guaranteed by the federal government on explicit condition, I want to emphasize that no homes be sold to African Americans, and that every home in the development had to have a clause in the deed prohibiting resale to African Americans.
The white Americans who were given government-backed mortgages for homes under this policy paid less per month to own a home than what black Americans paid for rent in public housing during this period. Those homes have since increased in value, netting those families $200,000 to $300,000 of added wealth. So, is the racial wealth gap really a result of black culture?
African American income on average is about 60% of white income. African American wealth is 5 to 7% of white wealth. Most families in this country gain their wealth through housing equity. This enormous difference between 60% income ratio and 5% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the 1930s, 40s, and into the 50s. So the wealth gap, I think, is attributable to this residential segregation.
It is obvious that a huge part of the racial wealth gap can be attributed to the federally sanctioned housing policies of this country, which included redlining, a means by which loans were explicitly and intentionally denied to individuals in black, redlined neighborhoods, and where state-backed restrictive covenants denied black people the opportunity to move into wealthier white neighborhoods. And so not only were black people not able to inherit wealth from their parents and grandparents, who were enslaved, but they were denied the opportunity to build wealth for themselves. It wasn't until 1977 that discrimination in lending for housing was outlawed. This meant that black people were relegated into living in areas of highly concentrated poverty with elevated levels of pollution due to their proximity to freeways and toxic facilities, which caused lower life expectancy and a lack of access to upward mobility. And insidiously, the racist segregation policies that created this concentrated poverty also led to over-policing, which led to mass incarceration, which led to the loss of political power, which meant that these communities were not equipped with the political power to oppose the creation of big polluters, which led to even further loss of property values, which led to less funding for education, which led to. So given this, it's not that surprising that 1 in 7 white families today are millionaires compared to 1 in 50 black families. Or that while single white women between the ages of 36 to 49 have a median net worth of $42,000, and single black women in this same age range have a median net worth of $5. This is also weird, you know? It's almost as if the racial inequality we see in this country is not caused by black culture, but by some sort of like a system, some sort of system that seems to involve a race somehow that gave white people some sort of like, I don't want to call it privilege, but I do, because that's what it is. So remember when Jordan Peterson said, it's not white privilege, it's wealth? Well, it turns out that wealth is a white privilege, a government-subsidized white privilege, and an important component to systemic racism that aggregates and grows over generations. So, you see, Ben, it doesn't really matter if we are more or less racist today than we were in 1960, because the inequities of our past collect interest. It's just also perplexing. I mean, I thought all the free stuff that created this culture of dependency was given to black people. I mean, that's why they're so lazy, right? I mean, all the free stuff incentivizes them to just be welfare queens and live off of Uncle Sugar, right? I mean, but then could it be that this free stuff from the government has actually been given to white people? Well, Doy Hickey, the Homestead Act, first enacted in 1862, literally gave away 10% of all land in the United States almost exclusively to white people. It is estimated that nearly 46 million people living today can trace their wealth back to this act. Around the same time, slavery was abolished, and yet the formerly enslaved got nothing. Not even their 40 acres and a mule. When Social Security was enacted to provide a safety net for the elderly, 2 industries were curiously omitted from these benefits: agricultural workers and domestic servants. Coincidentally, occupations dominated by black, Mexican, and Asian workers. The Wagner Act gave workers the right to create unions and the right to exclude black people from those unions, which they did. They did.